good morning or good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here. It's a real honor to me to be invited to the Philosophical Society, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you a little bit this morning. I think some of you are economists, and many of you are not. So I thought that I would talk a little bit more generally about things that are interesting to me, and I think interesting to you because it has to do with the financial crisis that has been engulfing the world, really, but Ireland also, over the last quite a few years. And I guess today is the anniversary of Ireland's agreement to rescue all the banks, I think I saw that in the paper. So that's a good time to talk about these sorts of things. But some of you may also wonder a little bit about the Nobel Prize. I certainly did. And I had no idea when you get the Nobel Prize, sort of how it happened. I didn't know whether they put this in a UPS envelope and it arrived in your door and you had to sign for it, or actually, how do you get the Nobel Prize? So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about that, because what happens is you get this phone call that comes out of the blue in October. Actually, next week they're going to start calling people for this year, and then in December you have a week of activities in Stockholm. And I think there's a purpose to that, because they're taking academics that have spent their lives studying and writing and doing esoteric things, and they bring them together and they train them for 1 week to face the rest of the world, to face the media, to face people in other fields that they don't know anything about. So I think of it as boot camp for academics. And so what you do is you continually ask to talk about your research, but without using any technical words or any technical phrases and so forth. And it's very hard to do. But that's what you learn to do in a week. And some people really don't like to do that, but we'll see. I do like to do that, so we're going to do that today. One of the things that this phone call ends with is a warning. I'm talking to the Nobel Committee in Stockholm, and they say, now before I hang up, I want to just say that when we tell the press, your life will never be the same again. Click. Whoa, that is a moment that you sort of, is this good or bad? I mean, I've been pretty happy. Do I really want my life to change? But of course, wonderful things happen. I mean, I wouldn't be here today, I'm sure, if it hadn't been for the Nobel Prize. So the question that the press, of course, wants to know is, what did you get the Nobel Prize for? Well, it's not so easy to explain when you're an academic. I started giving them an econometric model of volatility and risk and so forth, and the press said, no, I have to write a newspaper article on this. I can't do that. So then I sort of simplified it. Well, we're predicting volatility, and that is an important new thing we can do in econometrics. I said, no, that's not interesting. So eventually I said, well, it turns out that what we learn is that when the markets are risky today, they're likely to be risky tomorrow. He looked at me. They gave you a Nobel Prize for that? So in any case, what I got the Nobel Prize for was a model, a statistical model that helps you predict risk. And it's particularly useful in financial markets. That's good, right? You can get that. So the question really is, what does that really do? and what it predicts is really volatility of the financial markets. Now, volatility is a word in the English language that we use for all sorts of things, but what really do I mean by volatility when I say this? What I mean by volatility is for a stock market or a exchange rate or something like that. Every day when you listen to the news, the newscaster will say, the stock market is up today, or the stock market is down today. And if those are big numbers, we say the volatility is high. If they're small numbers, the volatility is low. So it's really the size of the movements in these asset prices. And so it's a way of quantifying how uncertain we are about what actually occurred. And it turns out that these kinds of measurements of volatility do have a property we call that's mean reverting. So when it's high, it tends to stay high for a while and then goes down. And when it's low, it tends to stay low for a while and then go back up again. So, this is the philosophical society. So I was trying to think about, is this very philosophical? It's not really, it's sort of economics, right? It's a way of measuring risk, because when it's high, it means you could lose a lot of money in the market the next day, but if it's low, you're probably not going to lose very much money. So it's a way of measuring risk, but is it philosophical? Well, I thought of it the way it sort of is. The question that philosophers like to ask is the future predictable? Could we predict the future? If volatility was really low, that means we can predict the future. What about if it was zero? Does that mean we predict the future exactly? So in financial markets, if we could predict the future exactly, they wouldn't work, because the uncertainty is fundamental. There would be no way that a company which was doing better than its competitors could increase its stock price faster than they did, because the stock prices would all be known in the future. So you have no reason to try to invest in the best companies or the best countries. You just put your money there just like you do in a checking account where the value is constant. So there would be no investment, there would be no way of allocating assets or resources to companies that had good entrepreneurs, and good management, and good business products. But this is the same thing that philosophers worry about if the future is predictable more generally. Where's free will? Why do you go to school if there's no volatility in the future? Do you try to improve yourself? Well, anyway, this is a topic that philosophy has talked about a lot, but essentially, volatility is a key thing, a key way of measuring the uncertainty of the future, and it's very important. It's important that it's not zero. It's bad if it's too high, but it would be bad if it were zero. So it's a way of measuring how things are going. And actually what we see is that sometimes we can predict the future much better than other times, particularly badly in financial crises. The risks are high in financial crisis, and our ability to predict the future is impaired in financial crisis. So that kind of pulls these things together. So let me tell you the question that the press asked me after the Nobel Prize. It was quite a bit after the Nobel Prize. And it was a bit of an unsettling question. They said, if you have such a good model for measuring risk and predicting risk, did you predict the financial crisis? Well, the first time I got asked this question, I didn't know what to say. I thought, I'm an economist, I'm a scientist, I should be able to answer this question. So I actually went down with my graduate students, we talked about how to do this. And we have a website at NYU called VLab, which stands for Volatility Laboratory. And what the volatility laboratory does is it produces forecasts of lots of different ways of measuring risk every day. It produces volatility models using this ARCH model that I got the Nobel Prize for, but it also produces them with lots of other kinds of measures, and we're going to talk about some of the other different kinds of risk that we talk about. So we have been doing this every day through the financial crisis, and the question was, if we went back and looked at it, how did we do? That's a good question, right? So the answer is that we were able to predict the future just about as well during the financial crisis as in other times in the past. So this is a model which is used for measuring risk in financial markets, and people who were in financial markets presumably could have used this model or were using this model to predict risk every day during the financial crisis. And if they did that, they would have had a pretty good, accurate measure of how risky the markets were each day. The risk was high, but it was correctly predicted. Well, I was very happy about this result, but then I thought about it a little bit. I told my wife, we really accomplished something. And she said, you predicted the financial crisis. How far ahead did you predict the financial crisis? And I said, 1 day ahead. She said, that's not enough. And that's the point. This model is predicting risk 1 day ahead. But in order to protect yourself during the financial crisis, you have to predict risk a year ahead, or 5 years ahead, or 2 years ahead, or some large amount of time so that you don't get yourself in a position where you're in trouble. So, one of the things that it's nice to ask is, what's the difference between a long-run prediction of risk and a short-run prediction of risk? And a nice way to answer that is that there is an additional risk. That is, there is a risk that the risk will change. So even though the risk might be low today, there is a risk that it'll go up. And that's part of the long-run risk, whereas in the short run, that's not there. So when we headed into the financial crisis, volatility was very low. Volatility in the stock market was low, volatility in exchange rates were low. The economy in the US, actually most global economies were actually doing pretty well. Irish economy was doing especially well in the 2003 to 2006 or so, and volatilities were low. So businesses who used short-run measures of risk thought that there was no reason not to take on more and more risk. They took on more what we call leverage. They made mortgage loans, which are long-term commitments that would be hard to undo on the grounds of short-run risk. So I think one of the things that I learned from answering this question is how important it is to think about what's the long-run risk, not just what's the short-run risk, when you start investing or choosing portfolios or investment projects that have a lot of illiquidities. That is, they're hard to turn around. If you're investing in the futures market, you can get out in a day. But if you're investing in mortgages, you can't. If you're building properties, you can't get out in a day. So this brings me to wanting to define another kind of risk. And this is what we call systemic risk. And systemic risk is a risk that is risk to the whole system, not just to the investor that we're talking about here. So, because some of you are not economists, I'm going to give you a non-economic definition of systemic risk. And I'd like you to imagine If I had PowerPoint, I'd be showing you this, but I'm going to get you to imagine it. There is a very tall tree, and in the top of this tree is a chimpanzee. Now, I never knew this, but chimpanzees eat insects. So he is at the top of this tree, reaching out as far as he can to catch insects. He's standing on a very small branch, and he's taking a lot of risk. So, should we worry about his risk? Well, if he falls out of the tree, he will learn not to go this far out on the branch. He will stay closer to the trunk of the tree. He won't catch as many insects that way. But this is the natural trade-off. The more risk you take, the more reward you can expect. And this is what we study in finance. It's what we think of as the way the world is supposed to work. So what's the difference between this kind of risk and systemic risk? Well, here's an example of systemic risk. The same chimpanzee is on top of the same tree, but now it turns out he's the last male chimpanzee. If he's the last male chimpanzee, we have a different feeling about him falling out of the tree and killing himself. It will be the end of the race or the end of the tribe. And so it's natural for the tribe to get together and try to decide what to do about this chimpanzee. So what are some choices? Well, when the town mothers get together and organize this response to this wayward young man who's up in the tree, they might think about some choices. I mean, one choice they might do would be to put a rope around him and tie it to the tree so he can't get out very far. But in that case, he probably won't feed himself very well and might starve. Another choice is they might hire 4 government workers to stand under the tree with a tarp. Now, that's a U.S. joke because we use the TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, to bail out our banks. So if you stand under the tree with a tarp to catch him if he falls, you're obviously going to keep him from killing himself, but you're going to encourage him to take on more risk. So the problem is, how do you encourage this young chimpanzee to take less risk when it's risk not just to himself, but risk to the whole society? And that's the problem with the banks. The banks pose a risk to society, not just to themselves. So that's where the idea of systemic risk came to the forefront, and it really exploded on our consciousness September 15th, 2008. That's the day Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. And that, by most accounts, is the date at which the financial crisis became far more severe and became really potentially a Great Depression like the 30s. But we might forget that at that same time, in the US, we had just rescued Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the mortgage giants, a week before. And on the next 2 days, we had to rescue AIG, the insurance company. We had to rescue Merrill Lynch. We rescued Bank of America. We rescued Citigroup. We rescued Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all through a bailout program that was announced the following week, although it took a lot more time for it to take place. And we also saw Wachovia be taken over and Washington Mutual go into bankruptcy. So it was really not just Lehman Brothers that was in trouble. It was lots of these firms that were in trouble. So we have a lot of discussion in the press in the US as to whether or not we should have bailed out Lehman Brothers. We didn't. We let them go. But maybe if we had bailed out Lehman Brothers, the financial crisis would have been better. But of course, if we bailed out all the banks, we would see that this sets the seeds for banks to expect to be bailed out in the future, and this whole problem of how much risk is too much risk would be exaggerated. So neither rescuing nor failing to rescue seems like a very attractive option. So is there a third choice? That's the question. Is there a third choice besides rescue or not rescue? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, which is the third choice. What is that third choice? The third choice is to regulate the banks ahead of time so that they don't take too much risk. That's exactly what this family of chimpanzees was trying to do. Regulate the risk ahead of time so that it doesn't accumulate so much. I think this is a discussion that happens here all the time too. And it's quite clear that there's lots of blame to go around for what happened in Ireland. The banks were took excessive risks, made incredible profits for a while, and lost incredible amounts of money subsequently. The government basically guaranteed the banks, and in the process lost their credibility and their bond rating, and the Irish economy spiraled down as a result. The regulatory process in Ireland didn't work. It also didn't work in the US. So the question is, would it work in the future? And that's one of the things that I think is important for us to pay attention to. How important is it that we have good regulation? Well, it's clear we don't want to go through what we already did, right? So that's, I think, the best choice is sensible, effective regulation. So one of the things that we do now at NYU is we have a way of measuring systemic risk. We measure using the same public website that you could see if you had a laptop in your lap with VLab. And by the way, if you don't remember VLab, think about the Volatility Laboratory, and if you Google it, will be either first or second on the list, and then you can just go see it. So what we calculate is a measure of how much systemic risk the banks are taking today. And we update this once a week. How does this actually measure systemic risk? Well, think about what banks do for a moment. We deposit our money in the bank. That's money they can use. They also borrow money from other companies. They take this money and invest it in various assets, including real estate, but other kinds of assets. They make loans to small businesses. They make loans to big businesses. And if these assets that they have pay off well, then the bank makes money. And if we want our money back, we can get it. If the assets don't pay off well, in other words, they lose money on these assets, then the bank does not have enough capital to pay off our liabilities if we want it. If we go to get our money back, it isn't there. So banks take what we call a lot of leverage, or I don't know whether you use the word gearing. They do a lot of gearing. No, okay. Call it leverage anyway. Because they have very small capital cushion, which is protecting them if there's bad news, compared to the size of their balance sheets. And that was especially true during the financial crisis, that the capital cushions were microscopic compared to the size of the balance sheet. So the risk was enormous. And this is really why we use these methods to forecast risk, because we'd like to ask, how much risk are the banks really taking? If we have another financial crisis, will they be able to survive this financial crisis? That's what we're estimating. And we use econometric methods to try to forecast how much capital a financial institution would need to raise in order to survive another financial crisis like the last one. We'd like to think that the banks had enough capital to do that, but do they? So, you may have heard of stress tests. Regulatory authorities and supervisors do stress tests where they use all the data inside the banks to get a very careful estimate of this number. We use statistics and publicly available information to estimate the same thing. And so we can calculate this number, which we call S-risk, for systemic risk, which is how much capital it would take for a particular bank to survive a financial crisis like the last one. So if we do this for more than 1,000 financial institutions around the world, and we add it all up, we get a global measure of how much capital would be needed, probably by governments, in order to rescue the entire financial sector if we had to do that. Or if we chose to do that. Might not choose to do it, but if we did it. And the answer today is about, I don't know, I think it's about $3 trillion. Which is a lot of money, but it's actually sort of what the Chinese have in their checking account. Or at least not maybe checking account, but in their foreign reserves, dollar reserves. But it's come down very substantially since the financial crisis in 2008. And it's also come down since what we call the sovereign debt crisis, which is the European version of the financial crisis, which happened in 2011, 11 and 12. And so there is an improvement, but its situation is not as good as it was before the financial crisis happened. Which countries have the biggest risk? Well, it turns out that today, the country with the biggest systemic risk in the world is China, followed by Japan, France, UK, United States, Germany, Italy, Netherlands. Anyway, so that gives you the flavor. Anyway, Ireland's not on that list, right? Ireland is a lot further down. Its systemic risk by this measure is not very high. But China, the interesting thing, it's increasing. Whereas for most of the world, it's decreasing now. For China, it's increasing. And this is a result of a lot of difficulty in managing the financial sector in China. And we could talk a lot about that. It could come up in questions, and we can discuss that as well. Within Europe, of course, we've got estimates for each country, and we have estimates for each financial institution. And the top few financial institutions in Europe, in terms of the dollars that they would need to raise if we have another financial crisis, are Deutsche Bank, Crédit Agricole, BNP Paribas, Barclays, RBS, SocGen, not a very good printout from the hotel, but anyway, that gives you the feeling. But the biggest banks of Europe are typically near the top of this list. So, what does this tell us about the future? What does it tell us about the past? Well, one of the things about this website is we can go back and see, just like we did for the volatility question, we can see what did this list look like before Lehman. What was this list saying at the end of August 2008, 6 years ago, who was on the top of this list? So it turns out the top of this list was Citigroup, then JP Morgan, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, AIG, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and there's Lehman Brothers, number 10. It's not at the top of the list. It's important that the regulatory apparatus be working. So the new piece of information is that regulation has changed in Europe. No longer do national governments do their own regulation. When you have the national regulator and one or two big national banks, it's very hard for that negotiation to be done well. Instead, we have the SSM, or the single supervisory mechanism, that has been agreed to by the Eurozone, where the ECB, the European Central Bank, is going to be regulating the largest financial institutions going forward, with the help of the national regulators, but doing it themselves. And as a consequence, all these institutions are going to be put on the same footing. They're doing an AQR, which is an asset quality review, and they're doing stress tests, and presumably, eventually, they will have lender last resort capability to decide whether or not an institution needs some liquidity help or some other kind of help that would be worth providing. And it doesn't make sense to do this unless you've been regulating and you know that they've made every effort to improve their balance sheet, and it wasn't enough, and so you need to give them some capital. So my feeling is I'm optimistic that the regulatory environment in Europe is going to be much stronger. I'm optimistic that the Irish economy is recovering, and that's going to be an engine for a lot of the other countries in Europe. And that we can see further growth and further improvements in prosperity without risking this financial crisis that we had before. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.